Hi, my name is Antony Loewenstein. I'm an independent journalist, author, and filmmaker. My most recent book is the global bestseller, The Palestine Laboratory. This is going to be a weekly podcast where I talk about my thoughts, ideas, and insights on issues of the day. And yes, I will speak about Palestine, but there's so much else going on. Silicon Valley fuckery, AI taking over the world, the far right in the ascendancy, various other issues that I care about, that you care about, that we want to hear talked about, that the mainstream media is not discussing. So get involved. Please support me if you can in the show notes. You can support me financially, and let's do this. I think there is a lot of hopeful thinking and delusion about the rise of the far right in much of the progressive world, that they look at someone like Trump and they take comfort in the weird way that he seems to be flailing and his allies are fleeing. But in a country like Australia, where I am, One Nation, which has been around since the 1990s, in a recent poll was at 18%. That is close to 1 in 5 Australians would vote for a far right party. They're anti-Islam, anti-immigration, anti-multiculturalism, way, way higher than the Greens. And there's no election in Australia for 2.5 years. That to me suggests that there is a profound rise in the sentiments of a party like that. And that should worry us. And yet it doesn't get talked about in much of the mainstream media. How is that possible? One of the reasons I think One Nation is doing so well in the polls is that at the last Australian federal election, which happened in May this year, 2025, the Liberal Party collapsed. The Albanese Labor government won essentially in a landslide. And the Liberal Party are flailing about. The far right is in the ascendancy within that party. No one knows what they stand for, and they're kind of eating themselves up. They're going through this inevitable period of working out what they stand for. That'll take them years. In its place, One Nation, which was for years derided as some weird fringe extreme party run by Pauline Hanson, the leader of One Nation, are now suddenly in the ascendancy. They are very much Trump aligned. Just recently, Pauline Hanson went to Mar-a-Lago alongside Gina Reinhardt, the richest woman in the country, to give a speech about how wonderful Trump is and what an inspiration he is. So she's introducing Trump-like politics. And I think many of us on the left live under the delusion that will never fly in Australia. We're not like America. We're much more sensible here. And yes, One Nation's not in government, but I think it's a delusion to believe that One Nation can't potentially do well. What we're seeing in Western country after Western countries is rise of anti-immigration politics, massive anti-Muslim, pro-Israel, deeply anti-Palestinian, certainly pro-genocide in Gaza. And although we like to think that's not popular, it is in large segments of the population. Now, whether they'll vote for One Nation at the next federal election is impossible to say, of course, at this point. But it worries me that many Australians who don't support One Nation, which is still the majority, think that an extremist party like that, who years ago, when Pauline Hanson first launched her political career in the 1990s, some viewers will remember, gave a deeply anti-Asian immigration speech.
I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians. Between 1984 and 1995, 40% of all migrants into this country were of Asian origin.
Asians are swamping the country. This is what she said, essentially, in Parliament. Now the concern is Islam. Islam and Muslims are taking over the country and they're going to introduce Sharia. So the nonsense argument goes. And I think that message has a lot of potency, not least because of economic and racial insecurity that exists amongst many Australians. And to dismiss One Nation's rise as simply almost like a comfort racist vote, I think is a mistake. And we need to take it seriously. So in many countries around the world, the far right is in the ascendancy. Much of Europe, US, the UK, And increasingly in Australia, even though we have a nominally centre-left government in Australia, I would call the Albanese government centre-right, but nonetheless not a far-right government. Although on some issues like immigration, I would argue they are not that dissimilar actually to elements of the far right, that a lot of people feel economic insecurity. They can't afford certain basics. They can't afford housing. And the narrative which tells them, as Trump said to his base, which was very successful at his last election, it's the fault of immigrants. It's the fault of Muslims. It's the fault of these extremists. It's the fault of those people, not white Christian Native Americans. Let's blame them. Let's blame the outsider. And that message was potent. It's working in France and Germany and Sweden. And in many of these countries, the far right's either winning elections or very close to winning. And I think in Australia, it's very conceivable in the coming years that a future Australian government will be in coalition with a one nation party. Policies around immigration, multiculturalism, diversity, Islam, Israel, the US alliance. And that worries me because we like to think of Australia as a multicultural country, egalitarian, diverse. But actually, huge amounts of Australians are deeply economically insecure and they're angry. And it's not surprising that in the last 2 months, you have on the streets of Melbourne and Sydney tens of thousands of far-right activists, including one of Australia's most leading neo-Nazis, giving a speech on the steps of Parliament House in Melbourne. This is not some fringe movement anymore. You had recently outside the New South Wales Parliament about 60 or 70 neo-Nazis standing there one morning on the weekend with a sign saying, "Abolish the Jewish lobby." Now that's 60 people, it's not 60,000, but that message actually, I think, resonates with a lot of people. So I'm not saying people should be hiding under the bed in fear. I'm saying we need to confront fascism where it emerges. There's no doubt to me that the far right is actually growing in popularity across Europe and certainly the US. And I've seen this in Sweden and France and Germany and the UK. Just a few months ago, the far right in London had about 100,000 people protesting, led by Tommy Robinson, a far right thug who was recently, by the way, invited by Israel as a guest to show what an amazing democratic country it is. Don't get me started on that. 100,000 people protesting in London for the far right, anti-immigration, anti-Islam, closing the borders. This is not a fringe movement. This is a mainstream movement. You see in France, Marine Le Pen's party has a decent chance of becoming the next president in the next French election. In Germany, one of the biggest economic countries in Europe, the far right, the AfD, is the biggest opposition party, polling at 25%. Their policies are anti-immigration, certainly, a belief of remigration, sending forcibly back people who have sensibly and legally settled in Germany, forcibly sending them back to Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, wherever. The UK government, a so-called centre-left government in Keir Starmer, has announced a new policy, which is borrowed from the far right, essentially saying that if you arrive legally as a migrant, you have no real pathway to permanent residence. Every 2.5 years, this is appeasing the far right, who will never be happy until there are no immigrants in the country anymore, at least not brown or black ones. And this is happening in country after country after country. So why would this not impact Australia? Why would this not infect us here? And let's be clear, Australia has a long history of embracing deeply racist policies. I mean, when the British came, we annihilated the Indigenous population. We had a white Australia policy until 50 years ago. We have sent refugees and migrants to prison and torture camps in the Pacific for decades, which the Labor current government has reinstated in Nauru just recently. So we are not immune from these policies. And often what non-far right parties do is they adopt those policies as their own. When Pauline Hanson as One Nation appeared in the 1990s, John Howard, the then Prime Minister, dismissed her, said she was a crank, essentially, but then adopted her policies. And you see this in country after country. Look at the UK, the policy I just mentioned about essentially never allowing a a pathway for migrants. That's a far-right policy that Labor is implementing a year after they took office in a landslide because they are desperate. So we in the West are not immune from that. We are not immune from these policies becoming the norm. And I worry that anti-fascist practices and protests, which are seen somehow as something from the bygone era, the 1930s, the 1940s, is needed to come back today because the risk of where we're at politically, to me, is very reminiscent of the 1930s. If the current trajectory continues and One Nation, Australia's leading far-right party, gets into government, becomes part of a future coalition, what does that look like? It looks like a reversal of Australia's multicultural policies. It means probably shutting the borders, putting up the walls, kicking out a lot of migrants who have arrived in the last 20, 30 years, becoming far closer to Israel, allowing far more US military bases. Hard to imagine that's possible, but it is possible. And becoming, I think, an uglier, more racist, intolerant nation. And that's what I see happening in many European states. Nations that have, to some extent, opened their hearts and their borders to people from the global south, whether it's wars often that the West has launched. I mean, it's ironic to me that so many Western nations are shutting their borders from people in countries that we assisted the wars to happen in the first place. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Palestine. Why do you think people are fleeing? They're not fleeing for no reason. They're fleeing because the wars that we helped create and fuel and arm. I'm really worried about what I see as the growth in the politics, not just of fear, but retribution. And in some ways, there was a term coined during the first Trump era called cruelty is the point. Cruelty is the idea here, that the idea of punishing people and making them hurt and making them seen to suffer is what a lot of people want to see. I'm not saying everybody. There is, for example, a sense that a number of even Trump voters in the US are disturbed by the Gestapo-like tactics of ICE since Trump has returned. Nature of these harsh policies, which a lot of people take comfort from. They believe, delusionally, that's going to bring them economic security or economic stability. Trump is not helping the US economy. In fact, a lot of Americans are disillusioned with his promises because they haven't delivered. So you can kick out 10 million migrants, 20 million migrants. If you can't afford a loaf of bread better, or you can't buy a house, who cares? In the end, your economic situation has not changed. And those policies do not deliver. It's the allure, historically we've seen this, the allure of fascist policies or fascist iconography, which is seen as appealing. But ultimately, it doesn't help people, putting aside the morality, putting aside the ethics of building a state based on exclusion and racism and, frankly, death, is not strong enough. Do we think the Democrats in the US are honestly going to push back against fascism? Really? You think someone like, who? Pete Buttigieg? God help us, he's going to save us from fascism? The Democrats may well win an election again because people are disillusioned with Trump. It's possible. But they're not the solution here. Two-party mainstream politics is not up to the task. The Labor Party in Australia, the Labor Party in the UK are not the solution to these problems. It's only going to come, as historically it always has, from people power. That's always been the solution. You need politicians to enact policies, but that's where it comes from. And I worry that there is not enough awareness of what the rise of fascism actually could mean. We're in a quasi-fascist moment right now, and I don't think enough people in the West are alive to that risk. The obvious point when people hear about the rise of fascism is, what can I do? How do I address this? How do I push back? I think making people aware of the risk is a start. That fascism doesn't suddenly mean that Hitler comes to power next week. Fascism doesn't mean that there are concentration camps in Auschwitz next month. That's not what fascism has to mean. What ICE is doing across the US is fascism. Going into schools and arresting migrants and throwing them into gulags, either in the US or elsewhere. That is fascism. That's what it is. And yes, there has been pushback to some of that in the US, and I'm pleased with that. But in other countries, that needs to happen far stronger. The idea of anti-fascist politics, whatever that might mean, supporting migrants, supporting the marginalised, pushing back against this, convincing your friends and family, if they're seduced by this message, to say that economic insecurity, the solution to that is not fascism. It never has been and it never will be. I think it's being aware, if you live in Australia, that One Nation, a right-wing, frankly racist party, is now the third biggest party in the country electorally, according to the polls. That is not a fringe movement. I'm sorry. That is mainstream. And although we like to think that it's not, it is. 18% is not fringe. The Liberal Party has collapsed. It is conceivable they could be at some point the second biggest party in the country after the Labor Party, who are in government. Now, what that means in years to come, nobody knows, but they are a risk. Be alive to the risk and deal with that in every way you think possible. Organise, push back, talk about it, address it, don't ignore it. The mainstream media here is not going to be your friend. This is a quick example. When Pauline Hanson went to Mar-a-Lago, Pauline Hanson is the leader of One Nation, Australia's far-right party, went to Mar-a-Lago in Florida alongside Gina Rinehart, Australia's richest person, and gave a speech. The Australian mainstream media reported that as if somehow it was just another normal speech on another normal day. I'm sorry, what? How is that a normal speech? How is that a normal day? It's not. It is a far-right leader giving a speech to a far-right leader. This to me is a code red moment. Be alive to it. Wake up. Thank you so much for listening. This is the kind of thing you're going to get every week. My comments, my thoughts, my insights into the issues of the day. If you want to give me support financially, I'd really appreciate it, because without that, this can't continue. There's a link in the show notes. This podcast will feature my thoughts, but also interviews with interesting people from across the globe. So get involved.